Daniel Shaw stepped off Meridian Air Flight 722 feeling as though he'd left part of himself behind in the cabin. The aircraft had landed at Coral Bay International Airport after a turbulent journey, complete with unexpected dips and shakings that made even the most seasoned travelers anxious. Daniel, an African-American man in his early 30s, wore a weary expression, and a couple of bruises from an onboard altercation that still haunted him. As he paused to adjust his shoulder bag, he noticed the man exiting the plane right behind him, Graham Hart, a confident-looking entrepreneur whose pressed suit and neat haircut contrasted sharply with Daniel's rumpled attire. Graham's expression was smug, the kind of look a person wore when they believed they owned every room they entered. Despite Daniel's obvious discomfort and visible injuries, Graham glided past without so much as a sympathetic glance. The terminal bustled with people eager to get on with their days, families searching for connecting flights, business travelers tapping away on smartphones, and tourists lining up for shuttles to beachfront hotels. Daniel tried to blend into the crowd, but it felt impossible. He couldn't shake the sense that everyone was staring at him, though it was likely just the residual adrenaline from what had happened on the plane. He pressed a palm to his tender ribs, wincing as a reminder of the turmoil aboard the flight flickered through his mind. Earlier, in the boarding area at Westford International, Daniel had noticed Graham in the priority line, exuding confidence and privilege. Whether it was Graham's dismissive glance or the way he nonchalantly shifted his luggage, something about him seemed to invite confrontation. Yet Daniel had shrugged it off, silently thankful for his first-class upgrade, a chance to stretch his legs on a cross-country trip. He'd hoped to rest during the flight, read a few chapters of the paperback tucked in his carry-on, and arrive in Coral Bay refreshed. Instead, within minutes of boarding, Daniel realized that calm was too much to ask for. Graham had made a snide remark about Daniel's seat assignment, questioning whether Daniel truly belonged in first class. It was an ugly jolt, a reminder that prejudice could surface anywhere, even 30,000 feet above the ground. And from there, things only escalated. Now, trudging through the arrival concourse, Daniel tried to focus on what came next, retrieving his checked bag, arranging ground transportation, and figuring out how to file a formal complaint about the events aboard Flight 722. Although he felt tense and unsettled, a determination stirred within him. He refused to let that man's sneer or the memory of his brazen words overshadow his reasons for traveling. Behind him, Graham maintained his leisurely pace, exuding an air of victory, almost as if he had emerged from a duel unscathed. It was a striking image, two men, one bruised and wary, the other smooth and self-assured, leaving the same plane but carrying vastly different experiences. Their silent tension hung in the air, foreshadowing the larger story that had begun the moment they first crossed paths. Though he managed to collect his suitcase and head toward the taxi queues, Daniel Shaw couldn't fully slip away from Graham Hart's looming presence. Even among the throngs of travelers bustling around Coral Bay International, Daniel sensed Graham's eyes following him. It was a sensation he recognized from earlier in the day, back at Westford International, where the man's audacious arrogance first reared its head. Daniel hailed a cab and directed it to a mid-range hotel near the business district. He had a work conference in 2 days, leaving just enough time to recover from the bruises and the unnerving confrontation. During the ride, his phone buzzed incessantly. Friends who'd caught wind of the flight drama through social media or news blurbs wanted details. He responded with brief messages, "I'm okay, just need to rest." But it was a lie. He wasn't entirely okay. His mind kept replaying the ugly moments he had endured only hours before. Once he arrived at the hotel, Daniel checked in and made his way to a modest room with a wide window overlooking the skyline. He sank onto the bed, exhaling deeply, then flipped open his laptop to begin documenting what had happened on Flight 722. The adrenaline-fueled memories remained sharp, Graham's condescending remarks, his thinly veiled challenge about who really belonged in first class, and the cabin-wide tension that followed. In Daniel's recollection, it all started when a flight attendant politely offered him a drink while he settled into his seat. Graham, seated just one row away, smirked and joked loudly to another passenger, wish they'd keep those seats for paying customers. Though Graham never mentioned Daniel by name, the implication was clear. Daniel tried to ignore the taunt, focusing on the in-flight magazine and telling himself that a stranger's contemptuous opinion was irrelevant to his life. But the dynamic shifted dramatically when the plane reached cruising altitude. Graham pressed the flight attendant, a young woman named Marta, into an awkward situation. Leaning over the seat divider, he slipped her a crisp bill and murmured something Daniel couldn't quite hear. Marta's cheeks reddened. She hesitated, threw a glance at Daniel, and then hurried away with a tray of empty glasses. Moments later, she returned and asked Daniel if he'd accidentally taken something from the galley, a bizarre question that made no sense. Stunned, Daniel shook his head. "That's nonsense," he said quietly, feeling his pulse quicken. "I've been right here in my seat." Graham let out a soft chuckle. "Could have sworn I saw you rummaging around by the drinks. Must have been my mistake, then." The false politeness in his tone was enough to raise a few eyebrows in the surrounding rows. Yet the seed of doubt had already been planted. A few nearby passengers glanced at Daniel uneasily, as if trying to gauge whether he might have done something wrong. Refusing to let the slur go unchallenged, Daniel politely called the flight attendant back. He insisted there must be a misunderstanding, and pointedly asked her to confirm no items were missing. Marta glanced nervously in Graham's direction, then mumbled that nothing was unaccounted for. She appeared apologetic but terrified of contradicting a first-class passenger, especially one as assertive as Graham Hart. Before Daniel could press the matter, she scurried down the aisle to the next service row. Meanwhile, the tension in the cabin began to simmer. A middle-aged couple, seated across from Daniel, exchanged whispers. The husband shook his head disapprovingly, muttering that it was shameful to accuse someone without evidence. The wife nodded in agreement but looked uneasy, as though she feared becoming the next target of Graham's manipulations. Another traveler, a college student with headphones slung around his neck, fidgeted in his seat, casting anxious glances between Daniel and Graham. Sensing he needed an ally, Daniel approached the attendant call button. But before he could press it, a second attendant, Elijah Keyes, appeared at his side. Tall and soft-spoken, Elijah bent down to Daniel's level. "I heard there was a bit of confusion over a missing item," he asked gently. Daniel took a breath. "I didn't do anything. Graham's insinuating I rummaged around, but I never left my seat." Elijah nodded slowly. "I believe you, sir. Let me speak to Marta and sort this out." Graham, overhearing their exchange, interjected with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Oh, let's not waste more time on this. If Mr. Shaw here says he didn't touch anything, that should settle it," he said, voice dripping with insincere graciousness. The college student piped up. "But you literally just said you saw him near the galley, didn't you? Now you're acting like it's no big deal." Graham shrugged and smiled, as though amused by the confusion he'd sparked. "Apologies for the mix-up," he replied, but his tone suggested he was anything but contrite. Elijah gave Daniel a sympathetic look before moving on to confer with Marta. Over the next half hour, Daniel felt the atmosphere grow colder. Some passengers seemed to resent the disruption, others seemed afraid to intervene. Even the pilot's voice over the intercom, announcing an upcoming patch of turbulence, sounded tense. By the time the seatbelt sign blinked on, Daniel realized Graham's influence over the cabin was more potent than he could have imagined. The man had manipulated perceptions with a handful of words and a small bribe, sowing doubts about Daniel's integrity. And although Elijah appeared to believe him, most travelers seemed wary of taking a stance, especially against someone as brazenly confident as Graham Hart. Daniel's hope of a peaceful flight evaporated, replaced by the uneasy sense that this ordeal was far from over. The tension in the cabin of Meridian Air Flight 722 had reached a boiling point. Despite his best efforts to remain calm, Daniel Shaw found himself at the center of a swirling maelstrom of accusations and dubious stares. Every time he tried to clear his name, Graham Hart would flash a subtle smirk or utter a patronizing remark, further tilting the cabin's mood against Daniel. Shortly after the turbulence subsided, Graham took the conflict to a new level. As a flight attendant passed down the aisle with the beverage cart, Graham accidentally elbowed Daniel in the shoulder, nearly causing his drink to spill. When Daniel glared at him, Graham raised his palms in mock innocence. "Oh, my apologies," he drawled, "but these cramped cabins can be so tight, don't you think?" His flippant tone made it clear he found the entire situation entertaining. A few rows back, Elijah Keyes, the attendant who'd shown Daniel some sympathy, observed the altercation with concern. He stepped forward, pulling Graham aside to issue a firm reminder about in-flight conduct. Yet Graham responded by shrugging off any blame, casting Daniel as an overly sensitive passenger who was making a scene. At one point, Elijah glanced at Daniel helplessly, as though wanting to help but bound by strict airline protocols. Still, pockets of resistance to Graham's narrative began forming among the passengers. The middle-aged couple that had whispered earlier continued to exchange uneasy glances, but they now looked openly distressed at Graham's behavior. The college student, apparently emboldened by the confrontation, confronted Graham directly. "You keep apologizing, but it sounds more like you're toying with him." Graham responded with an icy stare. "You do well to mind your own seat," he said quietly. The student blanched, perhaps realizing that direct confrontation might carry personal risk, especially if no one else joined him in speaking up. For Daniel, the physical nudge was the final straw. His ribs ached from the earlier scuffle, and the psychological strain was mounting. He pressed the call button, determined to involve the captain if necessary. But before an attendant could respond, Graham stood and made his way to the front of the cabin, where he had a brief, hushed conversation with a different flight attendant. Soon, a faint ripple of murmur spread through the passengers closest to them. Daniel suspected Graham was feeding them more lies, perhaps about feeling threatened or harassed. Moments later, Elijah emerged, face etched with worry. "Sir," he said to Daniel, "I'm afraid we have another report that you've been acting disruptively. I really need you to remain calm and keep to your seat. If this escalates, the captain might be forced to intervene." Daniel stared at him, incredulous. "I'm the disruptive one." "Elijah, you saw what he did, how he's twisting things." "I did," Elijah whispered back, "but that's not what he's telling my colleagues. And some passengers are backing him up, maybe because they're scared or just want this to end quietly." "I'm sorry. My hands are tied unless more people step in." Disheartened, Daniel sat back, scanning the aisle. Was he truly alone in this? Graham had effectively weaponized fear and courtesy, exploiting the fact that most travelers simply wanted to get through their flight without incident. Daniel realized that if he couldn't break Graham's hold on the narrative, he could at least maintain his own dignity. An hour passed in uneasy silence. The plane continued its journey toward Coral Bay, the seatbelt sign flicking on and off as the aircraft navigated pockets of unstable air. Daniel tried to distract himself with the in-flight movie, but he couldn't concentrate. Every so often, he caught Graham throwing him a smug glance, as though satisfied with the tension he'd orchestrated. Eventually, the pilot announced they were beginning the initial descent. The lights in the cabin brightened, and passengers stirred, collecting belongings and straightening seats. As Daniel reached for his carry-on, he heard a commotion a few rows back. The college student had pulled out his phone to show something to the middle-aged couple, video footage he'd recorded earlier on the flight. They stared at the screen intently, their expressions hardening with each passing moment. Curious, Elijah made his way over. "What's going on here?" he asked gently. The husband answered, "This young man has a recording that contradicts the story Graham has been spinning. It shows him elbowing Daniel, and it sure doesn't look accidental." He glanced over at his wife, who nodded in agreement. "There's also audio of him telling another passenger that Daniel doesn't deserve first-class treatment." Elijah's eyes widened. "May I see?" The college student handed over the phone, and Elijah watched the video with growing disbelief. Moments later, a second passenger chimed in, mentioning she, too, had taken a clip when the flight attendant had oddly questioned Daniel about taking something from the galley. Suddenly, multiple phones were out, and the story that had seemed so one-sided began unraveling in front of everyone's eyes. At last, fresh confidence sparked among the group that had doubted Daniel all along. They began demanding explanations for Graham's behavior, speaking in low but urgent voices. Word traveled up the aisle like a brush fire, and soon even those who had remained neutral started to question Graham's motives. Sensing the shift, Graham grew defensive. "Why would I have any reason to lie?" he snapped at no one in particular. "He's the one who acted like a threat." A passenger in the back, a woman who had been silent throughout the flight, spoke up. "You're the only one who's been dishing out threats and insults. We've all seen it. The evidence is right here in these videos." Tension crackled through the cabin, but this time, it wasn't aimed at Daniel. People were standing in their seats, craning to catch a glimpse of the footage. Murmurs of outrage passed from row to row. Elijah, stepping away to consult with the head attendant, returned moments later looking resolved. "Ladies and gentlemen," he addressed the cabin, "we take all passenger concerns seriously. We'll be landing shortly, and security has been alerted to this incident. Please remain in your seats until the aircraft has come to a complete stop." The announcement sent a jolt through Graham. He looked around, trying to locate some last ally, but found only stony faces. Even those who'd once seemed to side with him had changed their stance upon seeing the evidence. Daniel watched the transformation in stunned relief. At long last, the truth was surfacing, and the man who had tormented him with insinuations and half-truths now found himself in a spotlight he couldn't escape. The plane touched down smoothly, and a collective sense of anticipation rippled through the passengers. As they taxied to the gate, Daniel could practically feel the tension draining from his body. He was still bruised, still shaken, but no longer isolated in his search for justice. When the seatbelt sign dinged off, Elijah stepped forward again. "Daniel, I'd like you to remain on board for a moment so security can speak to you. And Mr. Hart," he added, turning a level stare on Graham, "they will want your statement as well." A hush fell over the cabin. Passengers gathered their belongings, exchanging sympathetic nods with Daniel as they passed. Some even offered quiet words of support. The college student patted Daniel's shoulder. "I'm sorry I didn't step in sooner," he murmured. "I thought no one would listen to me either." Daniel offered a grateful nod. "I appreciate what you did." "Thank you." At last, the final passenger exited, leaving only Daniel, Graham, Elijah, and a couple of other staff members. Security personnel boarded, ushering Graham aside first. He huffed indignantly but followed them without protest, his once smug demeanor evaporating under the gravity of the situation. When it was Daniel's turn, he told his story simply and honestly, about the accusation of theft, the physical nudge, and the cruel remarks that had made him feel unwelcomed in the very seat he'd rightfully purchased. Elijah and a few passengers provided corroborating statements. The phone videos proved critical, capturing the precise moments Graham had tried so hard to deny. Finally, the security officers thanked Daniel for his cooperation and escorted Graham away. Outside the aircraft door, the bright lights of the concourse beckoned, along with the promise of a thorough investigation. Though the ordeal had been harrowing, Daniel felt a sense of relief washing over him. The truth, though delayed, had emerged. As he stepped off the plane, gingerly rubbing his sore shoulder, Daniel realized he'd gained something unexpected from the confrontation, a renewed faith in collective decency. Even when a situation seemed stacked against him, the presence of a few brave voices, and hard evidence, had shattered the illusion spun by Graham's manipulative tactics. In that moment, Daniel vowed to carry this lesson forward, both in his professional life and in everyday encounters, that sometimes, standing firm and telling the truth is enough to tilt the scales of perception back toward what is right. Daniel Shaw could feel the energy inside the cabin shift the instant Graham Hart beckoned a flight attendant with a wave of his hand, and a thin, mocking grin. They were mid-flight, cruising at 35,000 feet, and the lights in the cabin had just been dimmed to allow passengers a chance to rest. Despite the soft glow overhead, tension bristled like static in the air. Daniel tried to distract himself by scrolling through the in-flight entertainment menu, but every muscle in his body remained on alert. Elijah Keyes and Marta, the two flight attendants who had primarily interacted with Daniel so far, were busy attending to a small group of passengers near the galley. But the man Graham had called over was someone Daniel didn't recognize, an older attendant with graying temples and a name badge reading, Stephen. From his seat several rows away, Daniel watched Graham lean in close to Stephen, speaking in hushed tones while sliding a folded bill into the attendant's hand. Immediately, Stephen's eyes flicked in Daniel's direction, then darted away as though he'd seen something distasteful. He gave a small nod to Graham, who lounged back in his seat with a self-satisfied smirk. Daniel's stomach turned. He didn't know exactly what Graham was up to, but the pattern was all too familiar: set someone else in motion, sow suspicion, and then watch the fallout. Sure enough, just moments later, Stephen made his way toward Daniel's row. He cleared his throat delicately. "Sir," he said in a measured tone, "we've had a report of inappropriate conduct. Could I speak with you privately in the galley area?" Daniel bristled. "Inappropriate conduct? From me?" Stephen lowered his gaze to his notepad, as though reading from a script. "It appears there was a concern regarding your interactions with fellow passengers. We'd prefer to clarify matters before they escalate." Daniel glanced at Graham, who was now pretending to be engrossed in a magazine, though the corner of his mouth quirked up with amusement. It was infuriating how easily he manipulated people. But Daniel refused to let fear or anger dictate his response. He had already been accused once of doing something he hadn't done, and these false allegations were clearly part of Graham's strategy. Standing up, Daniel winced, a subtle reminder of the bruises he'd sustained earlier. "All right," he murmured. "Let's go." Stephen led Daniel to the small service area near the rear exit door. The hum of the plane's engines was louder here, lending a strange intensity to the cramped space. A coffee carafe rattled on its stand as the aircraft hit a mild pocket of turbulence. "I'm sure we can resolve this quickly," Stephen began, his voice betraying a mild tremor. "Mr. Hart mentioned you were causing him distress, making comments, giving him hostile looks. He said he was concerned for his safety." Daniel inhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. "I'm not harassing anyone. In fact, I'm the one who's been on the receiving end of insults and intimidation. Multiple passengers can confirm that." Stephen pursed his lips. I see. Well, Mr. Hart also mentioned you might be, under the influence. Have you had any alcohol this evening, sir?" It was so brazen that Daniel actually let out a short, humorless laugh. "No. I haven't had a drop. You can check your own records of drink orders. I've barely touched the water they gave me." Stephen's discomfort was obvious. He fidgeted with his notepad, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they weren't overheard. "Sir, I don't want this to get out of hand. If you could keep things low-key, it would be best for everyone. The airline has protocols for disruptive passengers, and we'd hate to escalate unnecessarily." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I understand protocols, but you're barking up the wrong tree. Look, if you want to know who's fueling all this drama, talk to Elijah Keyes or Marta. They've seen Graham provoke me multiple times tonight." Before Stephen could respond, Marta appeared, carrying a tray of cups. She caught sight of Daniel and paused, an uneasy expression crossing her face. "Is everything all right?" "I'm trying to find that out," Daniel said, carefully. "Mr. Hart has apparently told Stephen here that I'm harassing him." Marta's eyes widened. "But," she began, then cut herself short. She glanced at Stephen, then at Daniel, as though grappling with how much to disclose. I might have additional context, she said finally, turning to Stephen. It's possible Mr. Hart has exaggerated events. Stephen exhaled slowly, relief mingling with uncertainty. Is that so? Yes. Marta hesitated, darting a look in Daniel's direction. Elijah and I have both witnessed Mr. Hart attempting to bait Daniel. He offered me money earlier to question Daniel about something he supposedly stole from the galley. Her cheeks reddened as she admitted this. I refused the tip, but he's persistent. Daniel felt an enormous wave of gratitude toward Marta for speaking up. Until that moment, she had seemed wary of challenging Graham's story, possibly out of fear for her job. Now, with Stephen present, she was openly contradicting Graham's claims. Stephen's shoulders slumped, as if he were carrying the weight of an uncomfortable truth. Well, that's quite different from the story I received. He rubbed a hand over his face. I need to let the lead flight attendant know. In the meantime, Mr. Shaw, I apologize for any inconvenience. I should ask that you remain in your seat and try to keep things calm. We'll figure this out. Nodding, Daniel couldn't help noticing a flicker of shame in Stephen's eyes. All right. Thank you, he said quietly. I appreciate you hearing me out. As Daniel returned to his seat, Graham peered over the top of the seatback, lips curled in that same grin. Everything settled? He asked, voice dripping with faux courtesy. Daniel ignored him, refusing to be drawn into yet another verbal spar. He sank into his seat, heart pounding, and stared at the overhead reading light. The flight felt endless, as though dawn would never come. He ached to be off this plane and somewhere he could breathe freely again. But at least Marta had spoken up, one more piece of evidence that might expose Graham's manipulations. The atmosphere in first class remained charged. Passengers who had drifted off to sleep were now stirring, aware that something out of the ordinary was happening. Soft murmurs spread throughout the rows, even the flight entertainment played at a lower volume, as if it, too, were attuned to the strain. Meanwhile, Elijah approached Daniel discreetly, crouching to speak at eye level. Marta told me what happened in the galley. She said you handled yourself well. I'm just trying to defend myself, Daniel replied, voice muted. Graham is turning everyone into pawns in some twisted game. I don't even know why. Elijah's expression was grim. Some people get a power trip from seeing how far they can push others, and how easily they can control narratives. The important thing is we're starting to see through it. Before Elijah could say more, Stephen appeared behind him, a wary look on his face. Elijah, can we speak for a moment? Elijah nodded, straightening. Daniel watched them step toward the front of the cabin, where a hushed conversation ensued. Glancing around, Daniel noticed a handful of passengers covertly observing him. He felt an odd mixture of embarrassment and resolve. By now, it was clear that Graham's attempts to slander him weren't going entirely unchecked, but the tension was still thick enough to cut with a knife. 15 minutes crawled by. With every shift in the plane's altitude or hush of an air vent, Daniel's nerves twitched. Finally, Stephen returned, carefully neutral in his posture. Mr. Shaw will be monitoring the situation. If Mr. Hart continues causing trouble or if you feel threatened, hit the call button immediately. The lead flight attendant is aware of these developments and will address them if needed. Thank you, Daniel replied softly. Graham, however, seemed undeterred. Whenever a flight attendant passed, he would make a point of drawing them in for a quick aside, no doubt planting fresh seeds of doubt. Yet after Marta's confession, some attendants looked less receptive. A few gently rebuffed Graham, politely stating they had duties to attend to. Despite the partial shift, it was apparent Graham still believed he could control the narrative. At one point, he caught Daniel's eye and winked, as if to say, "You won't win." Daniel felt a surge of anger spike through him, but he reined it in. Retaliating with insults or aggression would only feed Graham's claims. Outside the windows, dark skies and scattered pinpoints of starlight offered no solace. They still had hours to go before they landed in Coral Bay. Daniel feared that the longer the flight lasted, the more chances Graham had to twist perceptions. But at least now, the staff had glimpses of the truth, and Stephen's newfound caution suggested that not everyone was willing to take Graham's accusations at face value. As the cabin lights were dimmed further in preparation for night flight mode, Daniel exhaled, willing himself to stay patient. With any luck, the final phase of this journey would reveal Graham's intentions more clearly, and perhaps open the door for Daniel to clear his name once and for all. Elijah Keyes felt the tension radiating from the first-class cabin even before he stepped through the dividing curtain. His role as a flight attendant typically involved maintaining a smooth, comfortable atmosphere, but tonight he found himself navigating a social minefield. Graham Hart's manipulations and Daniel Shaw's resulting struggle were at the heart of it, and at 37,000 feet, there was no easy way to defuse the conflict. After speaking privately with his colleague Stephen, Elijah realized that much of the cabin now viewed Daniel with suspicion. Rumors spread that Daniel had been caught stealing, that he was under the influence, that he had threatened Graham. None were true, of course, but Graham had planted these seeds carefully, feeding on the fears and biases of certain passengers. Peeking from behind the curtain, Elijah watched as Daniel sat quietly in his seat, arms folded tightly across his chest. His expression was stone-cold. A few rows away, Graham leaned in toward another passenger, an older woman who seemed unsettled by the conversation but nodded sympathetically. Even from this distance, Elijah could catch phrases like, "I just felt so unsafe," and "people like that shouldn't be in first class." With a sigh, Elijah moved back into the galley, where Marta was cleaning up a spilled drink. She looked equally drained. "I just got cornered by Graham again," she muttered under her breath. "He's insisting Daniel belongs on some kind of watch list. I told him we have no reason to believe that." Elijah's jaw tightened. He's determined to paint Daniel as the villain. And the worst part? Some folks are too willing to believe it. A wealthy man in a nice suit claims something, and suddenly it's gospel. Marta's eyes flicked to a pair of other attendants busy with dinner trays. "You think any of them suspect the truth?" "Stephen does, at least partially," Elijah replied. He apologized to Daniel. "But right now, everyone's on edge, and I can't blame them. We're stuck in a metal tube thousands of feet in the air, hearing conflicting stories." Meanwhile, in the cabin, the tide of perception turned further against Daniel. He'd become, in some minds, the embodiment of trouble, the passenger who might lash out at any moment. A younger couple 2 rows behind him whispered about how it only takes one outburst to disrupt a flight. Even the seatmate next to Daniel, who had shared a cordial greeting when they first boarded, now sat angled away as if proximity might be dangerous. Daniel felt every bit of that shift. His chest tightened each time he overheard a disparaging remark or caught a wary sidelong glance. In the past hour, he had tried to speak to the middle-aged couple across the aisle, a couple who had previously seemed skeptical of Graham's version of events, but they politely brushed him off. It stung more than he cared to admit. What made it worse was that an almost tangible gulf had opened between him and the rest of first class. People literally leaned away when he got up to stretch or retrieve something from the overhead bin. At one point, he bumped the edge of a seat accidentally, and the passenger startled as if expecting an attack. As if on cue, Graham capitalized on this atmosphere of distrust. Pretending to show concern, he flagged down Stephen yet again. "I just want to make sure we're safe," he said, loudly enough for others to hear. "I don't mean to cause trouble, but can we really be certain he's not carrying something? Or that he won't lash out?" Stephen's face reddened, and he replied in a controlled tone. "Mr. Hart, there's absolutely no indication that Mr. Shaw is a threat. We've done our checks. Please remain calm." Still, the damage was done. A ripple of alarm pulsed through the rows. A passenger near the exit row tensed up, glancing at Daniel as though he might bolt from his seat at any second. Even Elijah, watching from the galley, felt an upsurge of anxiety in the cabin's collective mood. That was Graham's power. A handful of insinuations, repeated often enough, became a cloud of suspicion overhead. Unable to sit silently, Daniel decided to address the issue head-on. He pressed the call button, waiting until an attendant, this time, Marta, arrived. "Can I speak with the lead flight attendant, please?" he asked softly, but with a steely undertone. Marta nodded, her gaze sympathetic. "I'll let him know. Are you okay?" "No," Daniel admitted, glancing around at the stairs. "But I'm determined to clear my name." Moments later, the lead flight attendant, a stern-faced man named Willis, arrived. Daniel introduced himself calmly. "I've been accused multiple times of theft, aggression, even being intoxicated," he said, voice trembling with indignation. "None of it is true. I'd like the chance to present my side of the story, maybe see if others have video or accounts that refute these claims." Willis paused, tapping a pen on his notepad. "I've been hearing conflicting reports all evening. My priority is passenger safety and compliance with regulations. If you have evidence that contradicts what Mr. Hart is saying, I'd be glad to look at it." Daniel exhaled, relieved. "Thank you. I don't have direct video, yet, but I've noticed some passengers filming on their phones when the arguments erupted. Maybe they can help clarify what really happened." Willis pursed his lips. "That's an option. But I must warn you, we typically discourage filming other passengers without consent. Still, if folks willingly share, we might glean more information. Let me see what I can do. In the meantime, I'll ask everyone to remain civil and refrain from making unfounded allegations." Graham, who was within earshot, stepped into the aisle with a flourish of manufactured concern. "I just don't understand why you'd believe him over my word," he said to Willis. "He's the one stirring up trouble." Willis cut him off. "Sir, we're investigating all sides of this issue. I ask you to remain in your seat unless it's absolutely necessary to move about the cabin." Turning back to Daniel, he added in a lower voice, "I'll be in touch soon." That mild rebuke did little to quell Graham's influence, though. He proceeded to corner the younger couple behind Daniel, explaining, in a hushed, urgent tone, how he was simply looking out for everyone's welfare. The couple listened, nodding along, and their eyes drifted warily toward Daniel. For his part, Daniel found an unexpected ally. The college student from earlier, Noah, as Daniel overheard, stood up and walked to the aisle near Daniel's seat. In a voice loud enough to be heard by those around him, Noah said, "Hey, man, you all right? I saw some of that weird stuff earlier. If you need someone to back you up, I've got some footage on my phone." A slight hush fell over the nearby rows. Graham's head snapped around, zeroing in on the conversation. Daniel forced a calm smile. "I appreciate that. Would you mind showing the attendant what you have?" Noah nodded eagerly. "Sure, I can do that." Even with the promise of possible evidence, the weight of suspicion remained on Daniel's shoulders like a heavy cloak. He could see it in the sideways glances, the defensive postures, and the half-whispered remarks whenever he shifted in his seat. Some part of him wanted to stand up and shout, to call out the prejudice fueling so much of Graham's insinuations. But he also knew that any outburst, no matter how justified, would be twisted against him. Slowly, the flight wore on. Outside, moonlight bathed the clouds in a silvery glow, and inside, overhead lights cast sleepy halos on the passengers who tried to settle in for the remaining hours. But rest was impossible for Daniel. Each minute felt like a test of his composure, of his willingness to endure suspicion for the sake of proving Graham's lies wrong. Noah's footage might help. Willis's willingness to investigate might help. But until the entire cabin recognized Graham's game for what it was, an elaborate performance designed to ostracize Daniel, he remained an outcast in a space meant for comfortable travel. He'd paid for his first-class seat like anyone else, but prejudice, once inflamed by cunning manipulation, had turned it into a gauntlet of stares and whispered condemnations. Elijah, Marta, and possibly Stephen were on his side, but how far could their influence go? Would the flight land before the truth emerged, leaving Daniel's reputation in tatters among these passengers? Or would some last-minute twist finally reveal Graham's deceit? As the captain's voice crackled over the speakers, announcing another patch of turbulence, Daniel closed his eyes, steeling himself for the next wave of doubt sure to wash over the cabin. One thing was certain, he refused to back down or be silent in the face of baseless accusations. Even if half the plane had turned against him, he would stand firm, holding on to the hope that, by the time they reached Coral Bay, his name would be cleared. Night pressed in on Meridian Air Flight 722, with clouds veiling the moon and stars outside. The cabin lights were dimmed to a faint glow, lending an otherworldly hush to the aircraft. Yet Daniel Shaw could hardly relax. He was all too aware of Graham Hart's continual maneuvering, sowing seeds of mistrust among the passengers. Elijah Keyes had just passed through Daniel's row, offering a quiet smile of encouragement but saying nothing aloud. It was a small gesture that did more for Daniel's morale than any grand statement could. Meanwhile, Marta was at the rear of the cabin, speaking in hushed tones with a fellow attendant. Every so often, she glanced at Daniel, her expression conflicted. Then, unexpectedly, a new voice chimed in. Another flight attendant, one Daniel hadn't interacted with before, stepped forward into the aisle and spoke just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Mr. Shaw, is there anything I can get you? A beverage, perhaps?" Daniel looked up in mild surprise. The attendant wore a name tag that read Jonah Bright, and his posture radiated sincerity rather than fear. "I'm fine, thank you," Daniel replied. "I appreciate you asking." Jonah nodded, then hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one else was in immediate earshot. "Look," he whispered, leaning closer, "I've seen the way Graham has been trying to twist things. For what it's worth, I don't buy his version of events." A spark of relief ignited in Daniel's chest. "Thanks," he whispered back. "Sometimes it feels like I'm going crazy in here." "You're not," Jonah assured him. "I caught glimpses of how he cornered Stephen with that tip. A flight attendant should never take money to harass another passenger. This entire situation is not normal." Before Daniel could reply, a sudden commotion 2 rows up drew their attention. Graham Hart had stood to confront Elijah, gesticulating wildly. Though his words were low, the indignation in his tone cut through the hush of the cabin. "I'm telling you," Graham insisted, "Daniel's presence is making people uneasy. You as the crew have a responsibility to ensure we feel safe." Elijah maintained a carefully neutral expression. "I've already informed you, Mr. Hart, that we have no evidence Mr. Shaw has violated any rules. Please remain seated unless you have a genuine emergency." A few passengers craned their necks to watch, and Daniel noticed the younger couple across the aisle exchanging uncertain glances. Jonah inhaled sharply. "I better go handle the service cart," he murmured to Daniel before slipping away, presumably to avoid drawing Graham's ire. The tension was thick enough to taste. Daniel pressed himself back into his seat, trying to remain inconspicuous, but Graham's voice continued to carry. "If the airline refuses to act, then maybe I'll have to lodge a complaint once we land," he said loudly, ensuring the surrounding rows heard him. Quietly, Daniel's seatmate, a businesswoman who had barely said a word, leaned over. "This is getting out of hand," she whispered. "You realize half the cabin thinks you're some sort of threat." Daniel nodded wearily. "Believe me, I'm aware." She pursed her lips, then offered a sympathetic half-smile. "For what it's worth, I saw you do nothing wrong. I can't speak for everyone, but I know a bully when I see one." Without waiting for a response, she shifted back, returning her attention to the half-finished work on her laptop. Though her words were few, they eased some of Daniel's isolation. The flight attendant Jonah had shown him quiet support, and now this seatmate acknowledged Graham's bullying. Still, the overarching problem remained. Many passengers were spooked by Graham's accusations, and their default reaction was to avoid Daniel altogether. Not long afterward, Marta passed by, distributing blankets. She paused at Daniel's row and spoke softly so as not to alert Graham. "We're doing what we can," she said, handing him a folded blanket. "If you need anything, just press the call button." Her tone carried an undercurrent of apology, as if she knew it wasn't nearly enough. Daniel managed a nod of thanks. With that, Marta glided on to the next row, her posture tense. He felt a pang of empathy for the flight attendants caught in the middle of Graham's campaign. Their job was to maintain order and comfort, but how could they do so when one passenger systematically stoked paranoia? Several seats behind them, a faint scuffle or raised voice made Daniel turn his head. He caught a glimpse of another passenger, an older gentleman with silver hair, protesting quietly to his wife, "This is ridiculous. The airline should step in." Yet even he didn't speak loudly enough to draw Graham's attention. It seemed many recognized the injustice but hesitated to intervene. That hesitation, Daniel realized, was the key to Graham's strategy. If people stayed silent out of fear or deference to social norms in first class, Graham could dominate the narrative unopposed. A few moments of open confrontation could unravel him, but only if folks had the courage to speak up. Fate provided a small spark of hope in the form of Noah, the college student who'd filmed some of Graham's earlier conduct. He discreetly approached Marta with his phone, pointing to the screen. Though Daniel couldn't hear what they said, Marta's eyes widened, and she nodded, ushering Noah into the galley. Whatever they were discussing clearly alarmed her. A minute later, Elijah joined them. The three huddled around the phone, expressions growing increasingly shocked. At last, Marta stepped forward and cleared her throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said loudly enough to be heard in the first-class cabin, "we'd like to remind everyone to remain respectful toward fellow passengers. If you have concerns, please speak directly to one of our attendants rather than confronting each other." Graham attempted to interject, "That's exactly what I've been saying, someone here is making us unsafe," but Marta's tone was firmer now. "Mr. Hart, we ask that you refrain from further statements until we have sorted out the evidence." She held up her hand to quell his protest. "Please let our crew do its job." A ripple of murmur swept through the cabin. Daniel noticed a few faces turning to look at Graham with a new air of skepticism. Possibly, they'd gleaned that Marta and Elijah had seen something on Noah's phone, something that didn't line up with Graham's story. Still, Graham refused to back down. He sat, fuming, tapping a polished shoe against the floor in agitation. From time to time, he would glare at Daniel or cast pointed stares at passengers who seemed sympathetic to Daniel's plight. Eventually, Jonah took a strategic seat in an empty row near Daniel, likely to keep an eye on the situation. In a near whisper, he said, "They saw the video. It's pretty bad for Graham. There's audio of him telling another passenger how easy it is to frame someone if you just press the right buttons." Daniel felt a surge of gratitude toward Noah. "So does that mean the crew will intervene?" "They're trying to figure out how to proceed," Jonah answered, glancing down the aisle where Marta and Elijah were in tense discussion with Stephen and Willis, the lead flight attendant. "They might have to talk to the captain. But keep your guard up, Graham doesn't seem like the type to yield easily." In the next half hour, the cabin settled into an uneasy lull. Some passengers attempted to sleep, while others kept a wary eye on Daniel and Graham. The service cart rolled by again, and Elijah poured coffee for a restless traveler in the front row. Each clang of a cup or hushed conversation felt magnified by the tension saturating the air. At some point, Graham rose to use the lavatory, passing within inches of Daniel. As he did, he muttered under his breath, "This isn't over." Daniel bristled at the venom in his tone, but let him pass unchallenged. Clearly, Graham was doubling down on his malice. Yet, for all Graham's bluster, Daniel sensed the tide might be turning. The staff were no longer treating him with automatic suspicion. If anything, their tone toward Graham had grown clipped. Evidence was surfacing in the form of Noah's recordings. Even a few travelers who'd initially steered clear of Daniel were now rethinking their stance. Some offered uneasy smiles, others gave small nods of solidarity. Jonah offered a parting comment as he stood to resume his regular duties. "Hang in there. Once we land, the truth can really come out. In the meantime, try not to engage with him. That's what he wants." Daniel nodded, appreciating the advice. As the cabin lights flickered slightly, revealing they were entering another patch of mild turbulence, Daniel felt a surge of determination. No matter how hostile Graham's schemes became, he wouldn't cower or stoop to the same manipulative tactics. He'd remain calm, rely on the facts, and trust that the truth would eventually overshadow Graham's lies. Outside, the plane pressed on through the night skies, 1 hour closer to their destination. Daniel took a long, measured breath. He couldn't control Graham's next move, but at least he knew he wasn't alone. There were staff and passengers who saw the situation clearly. And that knowledge, fragile though it might be, buoyed him enough to endure whatever else Graham had in store. Silence swallowed the cabin of Meridian Air Flight 722 as the passengers attempted to doze through the darkest hours of the night. The overhead lights were at their lowest setting, with only faint halos illuminating the aisles. Some travelers wore eye masks or leaned against windows, lulled by the steady drone of the engines. But for Daniel Shaw, rest remained impossible. He sat with his back firmly against the seat, arms crossed protectively over his chest. Despite the partial vindication offered by Noah's video, he could still feel Graham Hart's gaze flickering toward him in the dimly lit cabin. Even with the flight attendants showing increased skepticism toward Graham's tales, Daniel sensed danger. If the man had gone to such extremes already, bribing attendants, concocting lies, what was stopping him from escalating further? A quiet shuffle alerted Daniel to someone moving up the aisle. He carefully turned his head and saw Graham approaching, shoulders squared, mouth set in a determined line. Daniel's pulse quickened. He told himself to stay calm. Jonah had advised not to engage, and Daniel intended to heed that advice. But it seemed Graham had other plans. Reaching Daniel's row, Graham stopped abruptly. "Mind if I get by?" he whispered, though there was no reason for him to pass. The lavatories were on the opposite side, and the aisle in front of Daniel was free. Still, he loomed there, forcing Daniel to either stand or remain pinned in place. Daniel pursed his lips and shifted slightly. "You have plenty of room," he replied, keeping his voice low and steady. An almost imperceptible smirk touched Graham's lips. Without warning, he leaned forward, pressing close enough that Daniel caught the faint scent of expensive cologne. Then, with a move so casual it could have been accidental, Graham nudged Daniel's shoulder hard enough to jar him into the seatback. Anger flared in Daniel's veins. He gritted his teeth, determined not to lash out. A single push back, and Graham would twist it as proof of Daniel's violent nature. Instead, Daniel inhaled slowly. "Watch it," he said under his breath, voice taut. Graham stepped back, lips curling into a sneer. "What are you going to do?" he taunted softly. "Complain again? Go ahead. Let's see if they finally believe you, or if they decide you're just looking for a fight." The challenge dangled in the air. Part of Daniel wanted to stand up, to call Marta or Elijah or Jonah, to demand they see what had just happened. But the rest of him knew better. The attendants were scattered around the cabin, busy with tasks, and few passengers were awake enough to witness the nudge. Even if they believed him, it would likely devolve into a he said, scenario again. As if satisfied that he'd rattled Daniel, Graham turned on his heel and sauntered back to his seat. In the gloom, Daniel made out a few bleary-eyed travelers glancing up, but no one rushed to intervene. It was like the entire cabin was cocooned in uneasy slumber, leaving Daniel acutely aware of how alone he felt in that moment. Slowly, Daniel forced himself to unclench his fists. He could almost hear Elijah's and Jonah's voices urging him to stay composed. There's evidence, he reminded himself. Noah's video, Marta's statement, Stephen's acknowledgement. Eventually, the puzzle pieces would come together. He just had to survive the flight without giving Graham further ammunition. Still, the next half hour crawled by as Daniel sat there, adrenaline making his heart pound. He replayed the nudge in his mind, Graham's smug face, the subtle force behind his shoulder. Was it truly a minor provocation, or was Graham goading him into a physical altercation? Daniel suspected it was the latter. One slip, and Graham would scream assault or claim self-defense. That was the pattern: manipulate, provoke, watch the chaos unfold. Just as Daniel's nerves started to settle, the cabin lights brightened marginally, signaling the start of a meal service for those who hadn't eaten yet. Elijah and Marta wheeled carts laden with coffee, juice, and pre-packaged meals through the aisles. Graham, apparently seeking to cause a stir, beckoned Marta with an imperious wave. "Miss," he said, voice carrying despite its soft volume, "I'd like my meal over here. But please make sure you don't give any items that might be problematic to certain passengers." He cast a pointed glance in Daniel's direction, ensuring the implication was unmistakable: he might steal it. Marta stiffened but composed herself quickly. "Sir, we distribute meals equally to all who request them. If you have special dietary needs, please let me know, but otherwise, oh, I'm sure you treat everyone equally," Graham said, the sarcasm evident. "I just worry about items going missing, is all." A small hush fell over the immediate area. The seatmate next to Daniel huffed in annoyance, clearly recognizing Graham's insinuation. Elijah, on the other side of the aisle, shot Graham a cautionary look. "Mr. Hart, we've already clarified that no theft took place. Let's not stir this up again." Graham raised his hands in feigned surrender. "Just being thorough," he said, with a grin that screamed anything but innocence. Marta served him briskly, then moved on to Daniel's row. She lingered a beat longer than necessary, her gaze meeting Daniel's in apology. "Would you like a meal or a beverage?" she asked gently. Daniel nodded. "Yes, please. Coffee would be good." As she prepared the cup, she leaned in and whispered, "Stay strong. Once we land, we'll have a clearer path to address this. Don't let him win." Daniel offered a faint smile, grateful for her support. But even as he took the steaming coffee cup, Graham's eyes bored into him from across the row, a predator waiting to see if its prey would stumble. The aroma of caffeine offered scant comfort in the face of that relentless hostility. A few seats away, Jonah and Stephen exchanged worried looks. Jonah set down a tray of cups and approached Daniel with a hushed inquiry, "He messed with you again, didn't he?" Daniel shrugged, mindful of Graham's watchful gaze. "He's trying to provoke me, yeah." Jonah exhaled, frustration clear on his face. "I'll talk to Willis again. It's unacceptable for him to physically intimidate you." While Jonah moved off to find the lead flight attendant, Graham tapped away on his phone. Likely drafting a complaint email or some notes he planned to use against Daniel once they landed. Each keystroke seemed to carry an air of foreboding. Daniel sipped his coffee, tasting bitterness that had nothing to do with the brew itself. Another wave of mild turbulence shook the plane, jolting dinner trays and prompting a few startled gasps. Overhead bins rattled, and the seatbelt sign lit up with a chime. In the midst of the momentary commotion, Daniel felt a passing thought: maybe, just maybe, the flight would end soon enough that Graham couldn't escalate any further. But Graham seemed unwilling to let the flight's final hours pass quietly. As soon as the turbulence subsided, he rose again, supposedly to discard a piece of trash. Passing Daniel, he let his elbow nudge Daniel's arm, a repeated violation. This time, Daniel jerked away, anger flashing in his eyes. Yet he remained silent, not wanting to give Graham the outburst he was fishing for. A passenger across the aisle, the same older gentleman Daniel had noticed earlier, frowned at the sight. "That's the second time he's bumped you," the man muttered, leaning sideways. "Why doesn't he go around the other way if he needs the lavatory or the trash bin?" Daniel shook his head. "He's determined to test me, that's all." The man grimaced. "I should say something. It's not right." Before he could, Jonah returned, eyes flicking between Daniel and Graham, who had planted himself near the trash receptacle. "We're documenting every incident," Jonah said quietly. "Willis is close to taking more direct action, but it's tricky up here in the air." "Tricky how?" the older gentleman asked, having overheard. "You have a passenger physically harassing another. That's grounds for some form of action, isn't it?" Jonah nodded. "Ordinarily, yes, but we have to follow certain protocols. If we misjudge the situation and forcibly isolate or restrain him without being absolutely certain, we risk a lawsuit or accusations of discrimination. We need undeniable proof or an outright threat before the captain can authorize that level of intervention." Daniel swallowed hard. The older man looked disgusted, but he understood the bind the crew found itself in. Graham had carefully skirted a clear line, intimidating enough to rattle Daniel, but never so blatant as to make it easy to clamp down on him. "I'm sorry," Jonah murmured, turning to Daniel. "We're trying to protect you. Just keep calm a little longer." Determined not to let Graham's provocations rob him of his composure, Daniel nodded. For the next half hour, he remained as still and quiet as possible, ignoring Graham's multiple trips up and down the aisle. Occasionally, Graham's phone camera seemed to be pointed in Daniel's direction, as though capturing anything that could be twisted into an excuse. The seatbelt sign pinged off once more, and the pilot announced they were nearing the point of descent. Relief rippled through the cabin. The final stretch of the flight was at hand, an hour or so until landing. Daniel clung to the hope that soon they'd be on solid ground, with the chance to present the truth to airport authorities or whomever might be needed. Yet as the plane gently tilted downward, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that Graham had at least one more play left. And indeed, the look in Graham's eyes across the aisle suggested he intended to push the envelope right up until the moment wheels touched the runway. If he could provoke Daniel into one final confrontation, one last meltdown, it might overshadow everything else that had happened. Daniel inhaled a trembling breath, steeling himself against that possibility. He wasn't sure what form Graham's next move would take, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't break. Not here, not now. Not with the end of this harrowing flight finally in sight. As the flight journeyed on through the dark skies, the simmering tension in the first-class cabin reached its boiling point. By this point, subtle hints and whispered conversations had coalesced into a palpable air of unrest. Daniel Shaw, still quietly enduring the barrage of baseless accusations and physical jostling by Graham Hart, noticed a gradual shift among the passengers. What had begun as a carefully orchestrated campaign of deceit by Graham was starting to unravel. In the dim overhead glow, murmurs of discontent echoed along the aisle. Several passengers, who once eyed Daniel with suspicion, now exchanged furtive glances and whispered remarks. It began when Noah, the college student who had discreetly recorded Graham's earlier misbehavior, passed his phone around. On the small screens, grainy yet unmistakable footage showed Graham elbowing Daniel aggressively and making sarcastic remarks that no one could now deny. A hushed ripple of disbelief passed from one row to the next. At the same time, Elijah Keyes and Marta, two of the sympathetic flight attendants, had gathered accounts from several passengers. They quietly confirmed that Graham had, on multiple occasions, offered money to certain staff in exchange for a narrative that cast Daniel as the instigator. Even Stephen, who had earlier appeared reluctant to challenge Graham, now wore a troubled expression as he admitted to having accepted a small tip under pressure. The evidence, both visual and testimonial, began to paint a very different picture from the one Graham Hart had so carefully spun. In the center of the cabin, a middle-aged woman in a neatly pressed blouse broke her silence. "I saw it all," she declared softly yet firmly. He deliberately bumped into Mr. Shaw. It wasn't an accident. Her voice, trembling with a mix of anger and relief, caught the attention of other passengers. Soon, a few more brave souls voiced their own recollections. One gentleman recounted how he overheard Graham saying, "He doesn't belong in first class," in a tone that dripped with disdain. Another passenger, an older man with silver hair, muttered that he'd seen Graham exchange whispered promises with a flight attendant, hints that further undermined his credibility. Within minutes, the atmosphere shifted. The once dominant narrative that Graham had meticulously built was crumbling. Passengers who had initially been wary of Daniel now offered him sympathetic looks. The energy in the cabin turned from one of division to a collective demand for truth. Some passengers even discreetly recorded further exchanges in hopes of gathering more evidence against Graham's misrepresentations. At the same time, the cabin crew's demeanor began to change. Marta and Elijah, emboldened by the emerging testimonies, huddled together with Stephen and Jonah near the galley. In low voices, they discussed the mounting evidence and how it clearly contradicted Graham's assertions. "We can't ignore what's on these videos," Marta said, glancing around to ensure no one else could overhear. "Our duty is to ensure that every passenger is treated fairly, and Mr. Shaw has done nothing to warrant this hostility." Elijah, his brow furrowed with determination, added, "I've already spoken to Willis, and he's reviewing every piece of evidence we've collected. The truth is starting to surface, and soon enough, everyone will see that Graham's tactics were nothing more than a desperate attempt to assert his privilege." In the aisle, a small group of passengers began whispering amongst themselves, their tone shifting from uncertainty to conviction. A young woman, who had earlier appeared neutral, leaned over to her neighbor and said, "I've seen the video now. It's clear Daniel is innocent." Her words, repeated quietly by others, created a ripple of support that could no longer be contained. Graham Hart, meanwhile, grew visibly agitated. Sitting in his seat, his perfectly tailored suit seemed to tighten around him as the murmurs swelled. Every time he attempted to interject or offer an explanation, a few raised voices would cut him off. A man in the row behind him snorted disapprovingly, and even a previously indifferent couple now shot him disdainful looks. His smug facade, so carefully maintained in earlier hours, was beginning to crumble in the face of undeniable evidence. Feeling the pressure, Graham's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for an ally. But with each passing moment, it became clear that the majority of the first-class passengers were rallying behind Daniel Shaw. Even those who had once trusted Graham's word were now openly questioning his account. The collective realization was palpable, a wave of truth was sweeping over the cabin. At one point, Willis, the lead flight attendant, made a formal announcement over the cabin intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are aware of some discrepancies in today's events. Please remain seated, and our crew will address your concerns once we land." The announcement, delivered in a calm yet authoritative tone, signaled that the cabin staff had recognized the gravity of the situation and were taking steps to investigate further. In that moment, Daniel felt a surge of vindication. Though he remained tired and bruised, a quiet strength emanated from within him. The support from fellow passengers, combined with the crew's gradual acknowledgement of the truth, was a powerful counter to Graham's orchestrated campaign of lies. Daniel realized that even in an environment designed to uphold comfort and order, injustice could fester, yet it could also be challenged when voices united in truth. As the flight continued its long journey toward Coral Bay International Airport, the atmosphere in the cabin was transformed. The once dominant narrative of blame and suspicion had been overturned. In its place stood a renewed sense of solidarity and a collective demand for accountability. Daniel Shaw, though still weary, felt a newfound determination. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was standing up for every passenger who had ever been marginalized by unchecked arrogance and bias. Graham Hart, for all his initial bravado, now sat isolated, his manipulations exposed for what they were, a feeble attempt to mask insecurity and entitlement. With every whispered conversation and shared piece of evidence, the cabin reaffirmed that truth, no matter how slowly it emerges, would always find a way to shine through. As the flight neared its final descent into Coral Bay, the cabin's mood had shifted dramatically. What began as an atmosphere of tension and confusion was now replaced with a resolute, quiet determination among the passengers. The earlier wave of evidence against Graham Hart had rippled through the cabin, and many who had once accepted his narrative now looked upon Daniel Shaw with empathy and support. In the final hours of the flight, several passengers gathered in small clusters, discussing the events that had transpired. A young man in a neat blazer, clearly one of the more outspoken voices now, explained to his companion how he had witnessed Graham's repeated insinuations and bribery attempts. "I never would have believed it at first," he admitted, "but the videos don't lie. Daniel was provoked time and again, and now we all see the truth." Across the aisle, an older woman adjusted her glasses and addressed a group of nearby travelers. "It's a shame that someone's ego can cast such a long shadow," she said softly. "But I'm glad we're finally recognizing the facts. No one should be made to feel inferior just because of who they are." Meanwhile, the cabin crew was taking additional steps to restore order. Willis, the lead flight attendant, had convened a brief meeting with his colleagues at the front of the cabin. In hushed, determined tones, he instructed them to carefully document any further incidents and to discreetly collect eyewitness statements from passengers who were willing to share their accounts. "We owe it to every traveler here to ensure that our service is based on fairness and respect," he declared. Daniel, seated near the front, watched as the crew worked diligently to set things right. The support from fellow passengers had provided him with a measure of comfort, knowing that even in a hostile environment, integrity could prevail. Every now and then, he caught a nod or a small smile from someone who had once doubted him, and each gesture reinforced his resolve. Graham Hart, on the other hand, was struggling to maintain his composure. His earlier bluster had waned, replaced by a growing sense of isolation. No longer did his neighbors defer to his authority or accept his version of events. Now, as the plane's descent continued and the cabin lights brightened, even Graham's most ardent supporters seemed reluctant to echo his claims. As the aircraft began its final approach, an audible murmur spread throughout first class. A group of passengers had discreetly compiled the video evidence on their smartphones, and they passed the devices among themselves, reviewing each clip with growing disbelief. "This is undeniable," one passenger remarked quietly, "and it shows exactly what Daniel says." The collective consensus was emerging: Graham's tactics were nothing more than a ploy to assert his privilege. In a moment of quiet defiance, Daniel stood up. Although his body ached from the physical and emotional strain of the earlier altercations, he raised his voice just enough so that those in his immediate vicinity could hear. "I stand by my truth," he declared, his tone measured yet resolute. "I did nothing wrong, and I refuse to let baseless accusations define who I am." His words, though softly spoken, resonated powerfully in the charged atmosphere. The response was immediate. Several passengers clapped softly, and a few more voices joined in, echoing sentiments of support. Even those who had initially remained neutral were now openly siding with Daniel, urging that fairness prevail. The sight of so many standing up in solidarity shifted the balance of power in the cabin. It was no longer Graham Hart's narrative that held sway, it was the collective voice of truth. Willis, having observed this display of unity, made an announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for landing, please know that our cabin crew is committed to ensuring that all concerns are addressed. We appreciate your cooperation and your patience as we work through this matter." His words were calm and reassuring, providing a stark contrast to the earlier chaos. For Daniel, the support was cathartic. The hostile stares, whispered rumors, and orchestrated manipulation had been replaced by a palpable sense of camaraderie and justice. In that moment, he realized that his resilience, his steadfast commitment to truth, had inspired others to speak out. It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore, it was about challenging a system that allowed prejudice and entitlement to flourish unchecked. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Daniel felt a quiet pride welling within him. Though the journey had been fraught with challenges, the collective awakening of the passengers offered a glimpse of hope for a more equitable future. In the face of blatant injustice, even a single voice, when joined by many, can alter the course of events. The final moments on board were spent in a reflective silence, punctuated by the soft hum of the engines and the steady rhythm of approaching wheels. Daniel settled back into his seat, feeling both exhausted and uplifted. The narrative had shifted dramatically during the flight, and now, as Coral Bay lay ahead, he knew that the truth was on his side. The seeds of justice had been sown, and from them, a stronger, more resilient community would surely emerge. The moment the plane's wheels touched the tarmac at Coral Bay International Airport, a significant turnaround in the narrative became unmistakable. As the aircraft slowed and the cabin lights brightened once again, a wave of relief mixed with quiet determination spread among the passengers. For Daniel Shaw, this was not merely the end of a long flight, it was the culmination of a battle for dignity and truth. Stepping off the plane, Daniel was greeted by a flurry of activity. Crew members hurried to assist with luggage, while passengers exchanged whispered conversations about the events that had unfolded in the skies. Many faces, once marked by suspicion, now carried expressions of empathy and respect for Daniel's ordeal. It was as if the collective experience had stripped away the layers of prejudice that had been so carefully constructed by Graham Hart. Outside, the warm Miami air felt like a balm after the tense confinement of the cabin. Daniel took a moment to gather himself, inhaling deeply as he prepared to face the next steps. The ordeal on board had left him physically bruised and emotionally shaken, yet there was also a profound sense of clarity. He realized that standing firm in the face of injustice had not only exonerated his character but had also inspired others to question the status quo. In the terminal, several passengers approached Daniel with quiet words of solidarity. A middle-aged gentleman offered a firm handshake and said, "I'm sorry for how you were treated. It's time someone stood up against that kind of behavior." Others nodded in agreement, their voices soft but sincere. These gestures, though small, reinforced the idea that truth and resilience could triumph over manipulation and arrogance. Meanwhile, the cabin crew, now visibly unified in their support, gathered to debrief with their supervisor. Willis, who had maintained a careful balance throughout the flight, acknowledged that the series of events had forced everyone to confront their biases and question authority when it was misused. "We owe it to our passengers to ensure that fairness is not just a word," he said, his voice steady. "Today, you all showed that integrity can prevail even in the most challenging circumstances." Graham Hart, who had once seemed so self-assured, now appeared isolated and defensive. His attempts to twist the narrative had been exposed by multiple witness accounts and video evidence, and he was quickly sidelined by both crew and passengers alike. It was clear that the tide had turned, no longer would his position of privilege serve as a shield for his misconduct. For Daniel, the day's events marked a turning point. In a quiet moment near the baggage claim area, he reflected on the ordeal. "I never imagined that standing up for myself would resonate so widely," he confided to a sympathetic listener. "But when you speak your truth, even a few voices can become a powerful chorus for change." News of the flight's drama had already begun to circulate on social media, and by the time Daniel reached the terminal's exit, local reporters were waiting with microphones and cameras. A reporter asked, "Mr. Shaw, how do you feel after such a tumultuous journey?" Daniel paused, then responded with measured calm. "I feel vindicated," he said, "not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been judged unfairly. Today, we've shown that the truth has a way of rising to the surface." As he stepped outside into the bright Miami sunshine, Daniel noticed a small group of fellow travelers gathered near the entrance, some filming, others simply watching. Their faces, once clouded with uncertainty, now shone with a sense of hope. The injustice they had witnessed aboard the flight had become a catalyst for a broader conversation about fairness and accountability, one that extended well beyond the confines of an airplane cabin. In that moment, Daniel resolved that his experience would not be in vain. He would continue to advocate for policies that promoted transparency and equality. Not only within the airline industry but in all areas of life. The flight had taught him that resilience, when paired with the courage to speak out, could spark change on a scale that no one individual could achieve alone. For Graham Hart, the consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. With his reputation tarnished and his influence diminished, he was forced to reckon with the reality that no one was above accountability. His attempts to undermine Daniel's integrity had backfired, leaving him isolated in a cabin that now resonated with the power of truth. As Daniel moved toward the exit, supported by kind words and genuine gestures, he knew that this flight was more than just a journey from point A to point B, it was a lesson in standing up for what is right. His quiet determination had not only cleared his name but had also inspired others to question, to challenge, and to demand justice wherever they encountered it. With the terminal bustling around him, Daniel Shaw stepped forward into the warmth of the Miami day, carrying with him a renewed sense of purpose and the unshakable belief that resilience in the face of prejudice is the first step toward lasting change.